Eli, Monroe had lived a quiet life since retirement, but when Karen Holloway clicked a silver padlock onto his gate, she unknowingly put an entire valley at risk. The morning had started like most others in early April. The smell of coffee filled Eli's kitchen as sunlight streaked through the curtains, casting warm lines across the pinewood floors. He stood in his flannel robe, reading the Ridgestone Gazette, pausing occasionally to sip from a heavy ceramic mug that had chipped long ago but still held together. Ripley, his aging black lab, rested at his feet, tail thumping lazily against the floor with each rustle of the newspaper. Outside, the world was slowly shaking off winter. Patches of stubborn snow clung to the edges of his property, while runoff from the mountains trickled through the drainage ditch behind his fence. The wind had that crisp mountain chill, but it carried the scent of wet earth and distant pine, a sign that spring was settling in for good. By mid-morning, Eli had swapped his robe for denim overalls and was halfway through reinforcing a loose board on the side gate when Ripley's ears perked. The dog gave a short bark and trotted to the front drive. Eli followed, brushing sawdust from his shirt, only to see a tall figure striding up the gravel road with militant purpose. Karen Holloway was impossible to miss. Tall, angular, and perpetually overdressed for any suburban occasion, she wore a light lavender pantsuit that looked better suited for a real estate conference than a walk down a dusty HOA trail. Her sunglasses, comically large, gave her the look of an overconfident fly. In one hand, she held a clipboard like a badge of honor. In the other, a small metallic object that caught the morning light. Ripley growled, low and uncertain, as Karen approached the gate at the edge of Eli's driveway. Specifically, the wide metal one that led to the easement, a narrow gravel path cutting behind a line of hedges. Beneath that path, 10 feet down, lay a concrete hatch protecting a floodgate valve installed by FEMA after the 2017 floods. Eli knew every bolt in that system. He'd helped design it. Karen stopped at the gate, glanced around like she was about to commit something heroic, then snapped the padlock onto the latch with a theatrical clack. Eli stepped closer, voice even. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Karen turned slowly. Per HOA Ordinance 14B, unapproved front-facing structures must remain secured at all times to preserve visual consistency. He blinked. "This is a private access gate. It's not even visible from the main road." She tilted her head. "It's visible from the community trail. That makes it part of our neighborhood's shared aesthetic. And frankly, it's an eyesore." Eli took a breath, temper buried deep. "That gate covers emergency infrastructure. There's a floodgate valve under that path." Karen smiled, like someone politely correcting a child. "There's no documentation of that in the HOA's beautification plan, and I've already submitted 3 complaints. Since no one acted, I have." He stared at her, the kind of long, silent stare that comes when a person is caught between disbelief and the urgent need to maintain their composure. Ripley stood next to him, ears back. "I could remove it," Eli said, "right now, with my bolt cutters." Karen crossed her arms. "If you do, I'll file a damage report and fine you for destruction of HOA-improved security hardware." The words didn't even make sense, but she spoke them like scripture. Eli didn't argue. He simply turned and walked back toward the house. His boots crunched on gravel. He paused once to glance toward the mountains, where the snow line had crept lower each day. The melt was coming faster than expected this year. Inside, he opened a closet, pulled out a rusted green metal box, and placed it on the dining table. It clicked open after some effort. Inside were old sketches and maps, hand-drawn by his grandfather, the original flood controller for Ridgestone, whose warnings still rang in Eli's head. "If someone ever messes with that gate," his grandfather had once said, "they either don't know what they're doing, or they know exactly what they're doing." Among the folded papers was a printed FEMA overlay from 2018. The easement, clearly marked in red, cut through Eli's property and ended precisely at the valve site. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it again with care and slid it back into the box. The afternoon passed quietly. Karen didn't return, but Eli noticed that no delivery trucks came by either. The mail sat undisturbed. The air held that odd spring tension, like the pause before a thunderclap. He made dinner, fed Ripley, and sat down with a weathered novel by the fireplace, though his eyes didn't linger on the pages for long. Later that night, just past midnight, Ripley bolted upright, barking toward the front of the house. Eli pushed open the door. The air was colder now, damp and sharp. From the porch he could hear it, not the usual trickle of runoff. This was something else, deeper, heavier. The low rush of water picking up speed under pressure. By the third morning, Karen had set up a folding lawn chair beside the locked gate, guarding it like she'd claimed a new frontier. The residents of Ridgestone had already begun whispering. Inside Rosie's diner, the scent of bacon grease and brewed coffee mingled with the low hum of a radio giving the day's forecast. A 30% chance of light rain, rising humidity, and snowmelt accelerating from the higher ridges. The place was packed by 7:30 a.m., as it usually was on Tuesdays, with farmers, retired postmen, and a few high school coaches sipping drip coffee from thick-walled mugs. "Did you hear?" someone said over a plate of eggs. "HOA's got that Monroe fellow's gate chained shut." "And she's sitting there like it's a royal checkpoint," another chuckled. Behind the counter, Rosie glanced toward the window without pausing her pour. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed, and had run the place since her late husband passed. She had a talent for tracking the pulse of Ridgestone without ever needing to leave her cafe. And today, the pulse was restless. Eli stepped inside not long after. He didn't say much, just nodded to Rosie and took his usual seat near the window. Ripley waited outside, leashed to the post where mailmen tied their dogs 50 years ago. Rosie brought him coffee without asking. "You holding up?" she asked quietly as she placed the mug down. Eli gave a faint smile. "Depends how many more ordinances they invent this week." Rosie leaned in slightly. "You thinking of speaking at the next HOA meeting? Because if you do, I might know a few folks who wouldn't mind showing up." Eli nodded once, grateful but cautious. "Let's see how deep the water gets first." And the water was rising. Back at home, Eli stepped off his porch and walked the short distance toward the drainage swale that curved behind his property. Snowmelt from the upper ridges had already turned the usually dry trench into a flowing ribbon of brown water, thick with runoff and pine needles. He followed it to the edge of the easement and crouched low. The flood channel was designed to handle up to 8 inches before overflow. Today it read just under 6, and it was only mid-morning. He returned inside, climbed the narrow staircase to his study, and unlocked the old rusted box behind a row of civil engineering textbooks. Inside, as expected, were the original Floodgate schematics, drafted by his grandfather in long-forgotten ink, annotated with notes in the margins like "pipe brace 17 week in cold" and "valve responds slow after first thaw." Comparing those lines to the FEMA upgrades in the new blueprint, Eli noticed something unsettling. With the early thaw, they'd overrun the projected flow rate by at least 3 weeks. If the weather reports were even close to accurate, the valve would need to be opened soon, or the low basin at Ridgebend would flood. He stepped back and exhaled slowly, placing the papers beside a yellowing copy of the 2018 easement agreement. Later that day, as he checked the mailbox, a government truck rolled by. A young city worker leaned out the window, waving a sealed envelope with an apologetic grimace. "Sorry, Mr. Monroe," the man said. "They asked us to deliver this." Eli opened it on the spot. Inside was a notice titled "Aesthetic Compliance Warning, Structure E17," citing non-harmonious visual elements and unauthorized accessibility signage. He folded it neatly and slid it into his coat pocket. Karen, meanwhile, was holding court by the gate. From his window, Eli watched her redirect an Amazon delivery van with exaggerated gestures, pointing to the non-existent back alley access. The driver shook his head, turned around, and drove off. Karen reclined in her chair, adjusting her wide-brimmed sun hat, sipping something from a stainless tumbler. Ripley barked once, then twice. Eli didn't blame him. By evening, Eli returned to the flood channel with his old tape measure and a red marker. He crouched again by the flow. The water was higher now, muddy, frothing slightly as it rolled over gravel. He marked the current height on a wooden stake he'd planted days before, then measured. 14 inches left. He stood up slowly. A storm system from the west had been gathering momentum all day. The sky above the ridgeline was dark, pressing down like a warning. That night, after locking up the shed and feeding Ripley, Eli sat at his dining table and flipped through the pages again. One note from his grandfather kept catching his eye. Valve must remain unblocked during spring melt. Risk, basin overflow, equals 3 to 5 homes. He set down the pen, rubbed his temples, and looked out the window. The radar showed a heavy storm approaching from the west, expected to hit by morning. Yet Karen remained at the gate, sitting watchfully as if nothing were happening. At dawn, lightning struck Ridge Bluff, and by breakfast, both forks of the valley stream were foaming white. Rain had hammered the town all night. By morning, Ridgestone woke to gray skies and a chill that cut sharper than usual for April. The local AM radio crackled with urgent updates, issuing a statewide emergency alert just as Eli pulled on his boots. His old raincoat hung heavy from the peg by the door, and Ripley whined low at the sound of distant sirens. The smell of wet pine and damp soil crept through every crack in the old house. Eli didn't bother with coffee. He stood at the back porch, staring down the path that led to the locked gate. Mud coated the gravel. The ditch had overflowed. The runoff stream, once a lazy trickle, now rushed with force, churning and frothing as it pressed against the culvert under the community trail. On the dining room table, a faded photograph lay beside the open Floodgate schematics. It showed the aftermath of the 2017 flood, 2 men waist-deep in water, one of them his grandfather, the other a younger Eli, hauling out sandbags with frozen fingers. That flood had cost Ridgestone 3 homes and 2 bridges. They had sworn never again. He grabbed his truck keys. Down at the gate, the scene had shifted. A red Ridgestone volunteer fire department truck idled nearby, and Fire Chief Mendoza stood with arms crossed, water sloshing around his boots. His radio buzzed with chatter. Rain fell in a fine sheet now, soaking everything, muting sounds beneath a constant hiss. Karen sat in her folding chair just feet away from the gate, wrapped in a pink floral robe over a gray sweatsuit. Her bare feet poked out from slippers. In one hand, she held a stemless wine glass. In the other, a clipboard. "No documentation has been presented," she said crisply over the rain. "This is HOA-governed property. You need clearance to pass." Chief Mendoza's brow furrowed. "Ma'am, we have 10 minutes before the Ridgebend Basin exceeds threshold. That gate blocks the only direct access to the flood control system." Karen sipped her wine. "Then go around." Eli pulled up just as Mendoza raised the radio to call it in. The truck door slammed. Eli strode through the rain without a word, boots splashing, eyes locked on the padlocked gate. Mendoza turned, relief flashing across his face. Eli said nothing to Karen. He walked to the back of his truck, pulled down the tailgate, and lifted a heavy length of chain. With practiced motion, he secured one end around the base of the lock, the other to the steel toe hitch. Karen's eyes widened. "You're making a serious mistake," she warned, voice rising over the rain. Eli slid into the cab, shifted into drive, and pressed the gas. The sound of metal shearing echoed like a gunshot. The lock gave, the gate groaned, then swung open with a lurch as the chain snapped back, clattering onto the soaked ground. The firefighters rushed through immediately. One shouted into a radio while another sprinted toward the concrete hatch. Eli followed behind them at a brisk walk, rain plastering his hair to his scalp. Within minutes, the hatch was open. A long-handled tool turned the underground valve with a metallic groan. Water roared through the system. Pressure gauges clicked into place. Somewhere down the basin, a narrow breach opened and redirected the surge safely west. The system held. Only one home, an empty rental on higher ground, took on water, but no one was hurt. Mendoza gave the all-clear. Karen remained where she sat, lips pale, wineglass trembling slightly. One firefighter approached her, handed her a folded sheet of paper wrapped in a plastic sleeve. "Interference with emergency response operations," he said flatly. "State notice." She stared at it as if it were written in another language. By then, another firefighter had already pulled out his phone, capturing the moment: the busted lock, the FEMA easement sign, the water rushing past the open gate. The clip streamed live onto the department's Facebook page. Eli stood off to the side, soaked and silent, his breath visible in the cold air. Mendoza clapped him on the shoulder. "Good timing," the chief muttered. "Bad timing," Eli replied. "That lock should have never been there." The truck ride home was slow. Mud splattered the undercarriage. Ripley met him at the door, tail low but wagging. Eli peeled off his coat, tossed it onto the hook, and sat down at the kitchen table without even drying off. He stared at the ceiling for a long minute, then reached for the kettle. Steam rose, fogging the window. When he stepped outside later to check the mailbox, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The box creaked open. Inside were 2 envelopes, both bearing the HOA seal. One read, "Cease and desist." The other, "Summons to conduct board hearing." Eli came home, his hands still trembling. In the mailbox were 2 envelopes from the HOA, one labeled "Cease and desist," and the other, "Summons to conduct board hearing." Eli hadn't even finished his morning coffee when the first envelope slid under his door, marked "Violation Notice, Emergency Action, Misconduct." The house was quiet save for the low gurgle of the drip coffee pot and the occasional creak from the old floorboards settling after the storm. Outside, the sky was still heavy with clouds, the ground soggy, and the air smelling faintly of wet cedar. Ripley snoozed near the radiator, blissfully unaware that the first strike of the next battle had arrived. Eli picked up the envelope and tore it open with a butter knife. Inside, bold letters screamed from the top of the page. "You are hereby cited for unauthorized property damage in violation of HOA Policy 18.3b. Attached was a fine for $800 and a notice to appear before the HOA Conduct Board within 5 business days. He sat at the kitchen table, steam curling from his mug, and laid the paper beside 3 more that had arrived over the past 24 hours. One accused him of creating a dangerous precedent for resident behavior during emergencies. Another charged him with demolishing HOA-installed equipment. The fourth, a cease and desist, ordered him to refrain from unauthorized interactions with any HOA infrastructure zones. He chuckled once, not out of amusement, but disbelief. "A floodgate is now a zone," he muttered to no one. After breakfast, Eli made his way to Rosie's cafe. The place was quieter than usual, the crowd thinner after the storm. Rosie gave him a sympathetic nod as he slid into the back booth. A few moments later, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses and a stack of folders joined him. "Morning," Matt Decker said, setting down his laptop. "You look like a man who's been buried alive in HOA letterhead." "Not buried," Eli replied, but I could start a bonfire with what they've sent. Matt, a paralegal who owed Eli a favor from a past plumbing job gone wrong, cracked his knuckles and opened his files. Let's see what kind of ammunition we've got. Eli laid out the documents, schematics of the Floodgate system, the 2017 easement agreement, FEMA overlays, and the photos taken by the fire crew during the emergency. He also handed over a printout of the HOA's own rules, highlighting the clause exempting emergency infrastructure from cosmetic regulation. Matt scrolled through a USB drive Eli had handed him, then stopped short. "Well, well," he murmured. "Karen's been busy." On the screen was a screenshot of an internal HOA message thread, likely leaked by someone inside. One message stood out. "Karen Holloway, we locked it." He can't prove it's federal easement, and even if he tries, it'll take months. By then, he'll either cave or drown in fines. Eli arched a brow. "She actually wrote that?" Matt nodded. "And here's more. She mentions Jenkins, the board vice president, as someone she has in her pocket for variance approvals. Says he'll rubber stamp whatever she needs." Eli leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then we don't just fight back, we expose it." That afternoon, Matt helped Eli send a packet to the Colorado Department of Emergency Management, another to Channel 5 News, and a third to the Regional Disaster Coordination Office. Inside each packet, a timeline of events, blueprints, the easement deed, FEMA flood zone status. And yes, Karen's emails. By sundown, Channel 5 had aired a teaser. A grainy image of the locked gate flashed on screen. The reporter's voice was serious. "HOA, president under scrutiny after locking off federal flood control gate." Social media lit up within hours. The video of Eli tearing the lock open re-emerged, now reframed by context and outrage. The comments were merciless. Hashtags multiplied. "Yars gate, cham let the water flow, shapa cham Karen locked, the floodgate." Eli stayed up late, listening to the buzz through a tinny kitchen radio and watching the town's Facebook group refresh faster than he could keep up. Some supported him openly. Others were still cautious. But the tide was shifting. At 10:03 p.m., his phone lit up with a push notification. Karen Holloway had gone live. The image was centered, filtered, and clearly rehearsed. She sat in her garden, flanked by manicured hedges, a tasteful stone fountain trickling behind her. She wore a pastel blazer and the same oversized sunglasses from earlier that week. "I want to speak directly to the residents of Ridgestone," she began, her tone soft and saccharine. "I only did what I believed was necessary to preserve the integrity and safety of our neighborhood. At no point was I informed of the gate's critical status. If anyone has twisted facts or misled the public, that responsibility does not fall on me." Karen went live on her stream to clap back. "I only did it for visual safety. If someone's twisting the truth, that's not on me." 3 news vans lined Main Street, and someone spray-painted "Let the Water Through" on the HOA clubhouse mailbox. By the time Eli reached Town Hall on Tuesday morning, the parking lot was already overflowing. Folding chairs had been set up in the grassy lawn outside, and the overflow crowd pressed against the glass windows, cupping their hands to see inside. Signs bobbed in the air. "We stand with Eli," "Safety Aesthetics," and the now viral slogan, "Let Eli Speak." Inside, the council chamber buzzed with reporters, residents, and board members who looked more nervous than official. Mayor Connolly stood near the podium calmly organizing papers. His presence, always more of a steady keel than a loud gavel, helped settle the room. He was Ridgestone's moral compass, retired Army, 2 decades on the council, and famously unshaken during the library budget riots of '09. At precisely 9 a.m., he tapped the microphone. The room hushed. "We're here today," he began, "to address serious concerns raised regarding actions taken, or not taken, during last week's emergency event. We will hear from all parties involved. Please remain respectful." Karen Holloway was already seated at the long table in front, flanked by 2 HOA board members. Her hair was perfectly curled, but her hands betrayed her. They fidgeted with the edge of a folder labeled Visual Infrastructure Preservation Plan. She offered a stiff smile as the cameras turned her way. When called to speak, she rose with composure but cracked on delivery. "I was never made aware of the Floodgate's emergency designation," she said. "The signage was unclear, and if the town had properly coordinated infrastructure communication with the HOA, none of this would have happened." Whispers erupted. Rosie, seated in the second row, shook her head and whispered to the woman beside her. Near the back, someone muttered, "Of course she blames the signs." Karen continued, "I acted in good faith based on the information available, and I remind the council that the HOA's duty is to uphold safety and harmony within our neighborhood. If an individual bypassed our process—" The mayor raised a hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. We'll hear from Mr. Monroe next." Eli stood, walking with steady steps to the front. He laid a set of documents on the table: flood zone overlays, FEMA letters, a highlighted easement deed signed by the town council in 2017. The pages rustled softly as he opened them to specific sections. "Gate E17 is not just private property," Eli said, his voice calm. "It's designated emergency infrastructure. That designation was communicated to the HOA 5 years ago, acknowledged in writing. I have the copy." He held up a printout of an email chain. Karen's name appeared more than once. "I didn't destroy property. I removed an obstacle to a functioning flood control system, an obstacle placed there in violation of town emergency protocol." Behind him, Rosie stood up. "My nephew plays near that flood channel. If that gate had stayed locked, we might be planning funerals right now." The mayor nodded. "Let's open the floor to brief public comment." One by one, neighbors spoke. Denise, a mother of 3, wiped her eyes as she described how her youngest child's school bus was rerouted last minute because of rising waters, and how her home sat just 30 feet from the overflow path. A retired firefighter stood next. "I helped build that system with Eli. Anyone who blocks that gate has no business overseeing safety." Someone from the audience shouted, "We've been scared of her clipboard too long." Laughter broke the tension, and suddenly people were clapping. The cameras caught it all. Mayor Connolly leaned forward. "According to HOA Charter Section 9C, a board member who endangers community safety may be subjected to an emergency review and removal vote. Would anyone like to submit a motion?" Rosie raised her hand. "I do." The mayor nodded. Motion entered. He turned toward Karen, who had gone pale. "You are now under emergency review and potential federal liability assessment." The room erupted, not with cheers, but with a shared breath of vindication. As the meeting wrapped, Eli gathered his papers. A woman he didn't recognize squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you." Outside, the wind had picked up. The crowd dispersed slowly, but the energy lingered like heat from a dying fire. Karen remained inside, her phone to her ear. As Eli reached the steps, he passed a man in a navy windbreaker, one of the quieter HOA board members. The man leaned in just enough to be heard. "Karen's not done yet. She's calling for a special board vote to delay the easement indefinitely." Voting day dawned clear and crisp. The floodgate stood unlocked, its new smart panel blinking quietly, ready. A gentle breeze rustled the budding trees along Maple Avenue as residents of Ridgestone made their way to the front lawn of the HOA clubhouse, which had been converted, somewhat ironically, into the town's official voting site for the day. The old banner that once read "A Vision of Uniformity" had been hastily removed, replaced with hand-painted signs that simply said, "Voting today," and "Let your voice count." Folding tables were set up beneath the shade of cottonwoods. Volunteers checked names, handed out paper ballots, and placed stickers on shirt fronts. Some people came wearing custom T-shirts. I voted for common sense, while others arrived in overalls, business suits, or Sunday church dresses. For the first time in a long time, it felt like everyone in Ridgestone was part of the same team. Eli Monroe stood off to the side, hands in his coat pockets, Ripley sitting obediently at his feet. He nodded at familiar faces, gave the occasional smile, but otherwise stayed quiet. The moment wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about the gate, about what it meant, about what it almost became. Across the lawn, Mayor Connolly made his way over, accompanied by Fire Chief Mendoza. "Results are coming in," the mayor said, squinting toward the tent where the final tallies were being entered into a tablet. "Looks like people made up their minds." A few minutes later, the number was read aloud from the small speaker near the ballot box. "By a margin of 87% in favor," the announcer said, "Karen Holloway is hereby removed from the Ridgestone HOA board, effective immediately." There were no cheers, just a long communal exhale, like pressure releasing from a tightly wound valve. Karen arrived late. She didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't glare. She walked straight to the clubhouse, collected a box that had been waiting for her on the steps, and left in silence. No one followed her. No one stopped her. She disappeared down the sidewalk with a plastic tote tucked under her arm and a clipboard sticking out the top, like a final relic of a chapter closed. The afternoon unfolded slowly, gently. Tables of food appeared, barbecue trays, lemonade jugs, pies wrapped in tinfoil with names like Aunt May's Peach Cobbler. Music played from an old boombox. Kids ran barefoot in the grass. And for the first time in weeks, people laughed without hesitation. Near the end of the gathering, the fire marshal stepped onto the wooden deck and called Eli forward. He handed him a small hand-carved plaque, the kind usually given at retirement dinners or local softball banquets. In recognition of quiet courage, it read. Eli smiled, a little shy, and turned to face the crowd. "I'm not a speechmaker," he began, clearing his throat. "But I'll say this. One lock stopped the water. One town stopped the chaos." That was all. He stepped down to a round of heartfelt applause. Later that evening, as the sky turned orange behind the foothills, Rosie brought over a folded letter. "Karen filed an appeal," she said, tone light. "Claimed procedural bias." Eli opened it, scanned the formal wording, and flipped to the last page. "No one on the board signed it," he said. She smiled. "Looks like Ridgestone is done being quiet." They stood there a moment longer, watching as families packed up, kids climbed into minivans, and the last ribs disappeared from a foil tray. In the distance, the floodgate stood still, clean and silent, its digital panel glowing green. It was just a gate, steel and sensors. But now it was also something more, a promise kept. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered in every corner of Ridgestone, from the clean water flowing through the reopened gate to the quiet nods exchanged between neighbors who once stood apart. What began as a single padlock became a reminder that silence in the face of recklessness can be just as dangerous as the flood itself. When a community chooses courage over convenience, even the smallest voice can protect something far greater than property. It can safeguard trust. And sometimes all it takes to hold a town together is one man, one dog, and a gate that never should have been closed. Let me know if you'd like a Vietnamese translation or if we're ready to finalize for full video production.